Hello, everyone. What an incredible block of films you just watched. On behalf of the Seattle Asian American Film Festival, I am so happy to be able to welcome these filmmakers who are joining us for a remote Q&A about all of their films. I want to just get us started, if we can, go down the row and introduce yourself, your film, and a little bit about the role that you played in the creation of the film.
So I will go first. Hi, everyone. My name is Joella Cabalu. I'm calling from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My film is Ode to a Seafaring People, and I was the director of this very short and sweet piece, and I'm glad that it's opened the block with something that's a little poetic. And me and my team were thinking about the film with such a limited time frame. We really thought about having something that's like a poem that would express the feelings of what it's like to be a seafarer, most of whom are Filipino. And in making this film, we also wanted to bring together the Filipino Canadian community in Vancouver and invite them to be part of the game.
Hi everyone, my name is Mika Yatsuhashi. I'm currently in Montreal, Canada, and my film is An Uninterrupted View of the Sea, which is an exploration of my family history and a reflection on how it impacts my perception of my American identity. And I was the director, researcher, editor, everything on this film. It was like a very personal project to me. And it's based off of a lot of archival material. I was working mostly from a FBI document that's housed in the National Archives in the States, and a bunch of family photos which are housed in the Sackler Archives, which is a Smithsonian Asian American museum in DC. Yeah, so this film was all about a lot of discovery and exploration for me as I started this research process with no idea that any of this existed really, and then kind of stumbled into all this material that really changed the way I thought about myself and my family history. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Amber McClure, and my film is Finding Dohi. And I am currently on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. I grew up here. I usually live on Oahu, but I am Kauai centric these days, staying with my mother, who is also, as you know, featured in the film. I was like Mika, because it's about my family, I was the producer, editor. I did not shoot. My partner shot the film when we were on a trip to Japan to specifically look for a family that we had never met or knew of prior to the film. So it was also happening in real time. So it was not a really scripted story. And yeah, I'll end there.
Awesome. Well, actually, both Amber and Mika, it's kind of nice that you brought up a little bit that archival material piece, because I did kind of have a question about, I think archival materials that are integrated into filmmaking, something that generally in the past has been kind of dry a little bit, but, you both did it in such unique and refreshing ways. What kind of thought process went into how you integrated those archival materials into your pieces?
Yeah, so yeah, my film is completely dependent on archival material, and I kind of knew that I wanted it to be like that going into it. I limited myself for this film. I just knew I didn't want any talking heads, or I didn't even want voiceover in the beginning, but then it got a little bit too complicated. And yeah, so I wanted to present the archive material kind of as I wanted to be able to reflect the emotional connection I felt to the material as I was discovering it. So I came up with the kind of scrolling text that I used on the FBI material, which was just like me with a piece of paper moving the paper in front of the camera. And yeah, I also knew I wanted to keep it as textured as possible. I rephotographed the FBI document just to help bring it to life a little bit more. Yeah.
For me, it was a struggle to figure out what was the correct balance of providing background on the history of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. In Hawaii, even, it's not a given that somebody who was born and raised here knows the history. So I wanted to not be too heavy on the history, but it's also really important because the experience of Japanese Americans in Hawaii during World War II was completely different from what was happening on the west coast of the US. So I tried to limit it to about 5 minutes or so. And it was also important to have archival footage so that people could get an idea of what the sugar plantations looked like. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of archival material because for a lot of reasons, most people didn't have any money. There's no vacation videos or films of what it was like in the plantations. It got to be a little bit confusing because there are so many different names. And if you're not familiar with Japanese names, you would find it hard to keep track of who's who. So luckily, a colleague who is an animator helped to do some really simple animations. So I think that helped quite a bit with not just keeping track with everyone, but also integrating some of the photos so that you could recognize, oh, that person in that photo is this person on the tree.
Yeah, and then I think all of you at some point, kind of as you were introducing your films, talk a lot about whether these histories, they're kind of at once both deeply personal, but also these larger histories as well. You know, I think Joella in particular, your film is shot in such a way, it's very intimate, but you are telling this massive history. How did you balance that sort of, you know, intimacy of the shots with that sort of large scale history of the poem?
Thank you. I should say that the film was produced by Lantern Films, and it was part of a commission by our public broadcaster in BC, Knowledge Network. And it was an initiative to tell the history of British Columbia by commissioning a number of short films. And we're fortunate that this is one of 100 that was commissioned, but also the one of only one Filipino story of the whole of British Columbia. So that was something to consider when we were going into this, like what does British Columbia, but also thinking outside of our province, but also even outside of our country, what is something that's unknown to larger audiences. And it was something that was new to me, that just down the road from me is the Port of Vancouver. And there is a building there called the Mission to Seafarers, which is essentially a home away from home for seafarers who are on the ocean out there in the shipping vessels. And it's just going through learning more about the history of the seafarers through the Mission to Seafarers. Got to learn more about the loneliness and the feelings of invisibility. But these are also people that contribute so much to our economy, and not only in British Columbia, but all around the world. And so given that it's such a short time frame, we kind of moved away from like telling a factual story or factual history right into what is it like for someone who is a seafarer. And as me and my producer, Jessica Hallenbeck, when we connected with the Filipino community in Vancouver, so many people were unaware of this history as well. And we found a way that to engage the the very thriving literary community that's here to be involved, and how do we bring in all of this history of seafaring in the Philippines, but also not in BC, but all around the world. How can we try to create that kind of essential feeling of loneliness, but also pride in this calling? So it was very much a delicate balance all the way through of how would this connect to other communities outside of Vancouver. And I think it was just trying to really go for the personal, I think was my goal.
Awesome. You've all kind of touched on this a little bit in previous answers, but I did have it as a separate question. You know, all of these films in this block are so dependent on sort of unearthing or preserving histories that have been forgotten to some degree. And so what was the research process like for all of these films? And, you know, we've already talked a little bit about those archival materials, but more generally, like, what kind of emotions did it draw out from you or your team as you were going through these research processes?
I think I've alluded to some of it already, but we made sure to connect with the community here and speak with people that had connections to not only the organization Mission to Seafarers, but also speak to former seafarers. And so that for such a short piece, there was a lot of pre-production and like developing and building of relationships and trust. So that was the key thing that I took away from this experience that I want to continue with my next projects.
Yeah, for me, the research process was kind of just always full of surprises. I never really knew where it would take me. Just for a little bit of background information, the film is about my dad's father's family, so my grandfather's family. But I've grown up all my life with my grandmother because my grandfather died in the 80s, way before I was born. So I was very disconnected from that part of the family history. My grandmother immigrated from Japan and brought all this experience of and these stories of being new to America and adapting to the culture here. So I don't know, it didn't sink in really for me until I started working on this project that how long my grandfather's family had been in the US for. So yeah, I kind of started this process very blind. I searched my last name in the National Archives Finding Aid website, kind of not really expecting much to come up. And then I came across a internment card for him, which made me very confused because my family was located on the East Coast, so they weren't interned during World War II. So I contacted the National Archives and kind of went through all of the bureaucratic hoops to get to the document, and it turns out that what I found in my initial search was a placeholder for a much longer FBI file that I also had no idea existed. My grandmother had always said my grandfather told her that the FBI had watched his family during World War II, but I don't know, a part of me just never believed it, or it hadn't sunk in really until I got the scans of this FBI document that's describing my family and describing my great-grandfather. And yeah, it was just kind of a shock. And I feel like the emotions connected to that document were definitely anger at first. I was just kind of, it was very confusing and kind of heartbreaking to read it. A lot of the document is focused on my family's beach house, which they were restricted to going to during the war because the government was concerned that since there was an uninterrupted view of the sea, that they could communicate with Japanese spies offshore, which was kind of just completely unfounded. Yeah, so that's kind of what started my search. And then I became aware of there's a archive of my great-grandfather's possessions in the Sackler Museum in DC. So that my family had been aware of, and that they knew that was there, and everyone had visited it. But I think I was just finally of the age where I was interested in what was in there. So that was a whole other emotional experience, because instead of getting this kind of cold, calculating description of this family, I was looking through their family photo albums. I found out that my great grandfather had a real passion for photography. They're all like beautiful, all these beautiful pictures he had taken from the 1920s up till the 1950s. So that painted this really intimate portrait of this family that I had everyone had kind of died off before I was born. So yeah, that was my experience in discovering. It was like two very conflicting emotions in looking at these different archival materials.
I feel a strong connection with Mika's story. The main difference for me was I knew of my grandparents, but the story of my mom's family began in Hawaii. As far as I knew, there was nothing that anybody seemed to know about what came before. And my mom had reached out to all of her cousins to try to find out anything she could about the family, specifically her father's side of, I'm sorry, her mother's side of the family. And I did not get to meet my grandparents. My mother also did not really get to know her grandparents. So there was a real sense of loneliness, disconnection, and a longing to understand more about what came before. I'm an only child, and I think my mom felt a real guilt about not having more children, not having more family to surround me with. So she's always been very interested in genealogy. I just picked up where she left off, and because I have a lot of connections with Japan. I studied Japanese in Japan, and I teach English to Japanese students on occasion. So through those connections and Kauai's sister island in Japan, Oshima, there is a museum dedicated to Japanese immigration to Hawaii specifically. It's fascinating that it's that specific. And we were able to visit the museum, and the rapid pace of the discovery was shocking, because we had spent over 20 years trying to figure out these details, but we just needed a few people to help us put these pieces into place. And luckily we had a camera, and it was all the footage you see in Japan, that was all filmed over 2 days. The first day we visited the museum and got to see the island and visit the area where both of my great grandparents were from. So my grandfather's parents and my grandmother's parents were both from the same area, neighboring villages, and their marriage was arranged on Kauai, as it often was for people, because they were looking for connections in this new place in Hawaii. And it just happened. I think we had the right combination of people and energy, if you want to call it that. A lot of people said your ancestors must be making this happen and pulling strings as the story got woven together. It was truly amazing. And I know it doesn't necessarily happen that way for everyone. I certainly did not ever think that would happen for our family, to have an interesting enough story to share. But I think that's the whole point. Every family has interesting stories, and that's really what I want to convey to viewers. Everybody's got something interesting. You just have to keep asking. And the most challenging part, honestly, was getting my mom to talk. This is all extremely emotional for her, and there were a few times when we were shooting that she really broke down, and it was really hard for me to edit. There were some days I'd be editing and I would just cry, and I'd have to stop, and I could feel the weight of her sadness, and then losing her parents when she was really young, not getting to meet her grandparents, and discovering there are all these people that got cut off from each other. A lot of it had to do with World War II. And then the decision a lot of families made to not teach their kids Japanese. My mom was raised Christian. She really did not know much about herself or her identity because nobody would talk about it. They really wouldn't. So yes, getting my mom to talk was really hard, but she was key to the story. So I also had tried to not include any interviews with me and my mom, but it got to the point where as we watched the scenes that I spliced together, we realized we had to include a little bit more because it just didn't make sense. We couldn't piece it all together. So we had to shoot some post interviews to explain what happened and get the viewer from A to Z, as it were.
Alrighty, and for our last question, I'm going to say something that maybe feels a little basic as we're talking about it in the context of an Asian American film festival, but I think even more so, this block is so much about the stories and the histories that make us uniquely a part of that diasporic experience. And as you think about, what you experienced and what you learned making these films, what is, one piece of advice that you would want to give aspiring Asian American, Pacific Islander filmmakers who are, really reaching out and looking to preserve these diasporic histories?
Oh, that's a big one. I don't think I have anything necessarily that's advice, but more of just the feeling that I was so proud to achieve this sense of community, that bringing together, working with the poet Saul Diana, and working with him to create this poem and inviting the community in Vancouver. We filmed that on the end of February last year, and it was like 2 weeks later was the shutdown. And I look back at those photos and I just feel like I feel so fortunate that we were able to bring in the community, not only for myself, so I can be surrounded and be with other Filipinos that have so many different kinds of experiences of not only their knowledge of the seafaring community, but also, as you mentioned, like their own histories, and so this was that one gift that I could give of like being part of this, of learning this very small part of the BC history, but also our global Filipino history. I think that's the one thing is always kind of thinking about striving for that to bring in. This is filmmaking is so much sometimes like a solo solitude kind of work, but what I guess in this experience of making this film and finishing it in the early days of the pandemic has been that the importance of that community and how do we connect with that, and share histories as well.
Yeah, this is a tough question. I think I would say just don't be afraid to be interested in what you're interested in, even if it seems like everyone else around you isn't necessarily as excited about it as you are, because ultimately, if you're passionate about something, if you're passionate about your history, if you're passionate about sharing parts of your culture, then that comes through in whatever you end up making. And for me, that's most important. And yeah, for a while with this film, it's more abstract, I think, than a lot of films talking about this type of history are. And a lot of people tried to tell me to make it clear, to make it more communicative. And yeah, but I am so happy I I stayed true to how I wanted it to look like and what I wanted it to sound like, because I was so happy when I finished it and when it was like all mixed and mastered. Yeah, and even more so when I did get to share it with people and people did understand it and people did like it and connected with it. And it was how I wanted it to be. So that would be my advice, is just really stay true to what your idea and what your vision is, and be confident in yourself to be able to communicate whatever you need to communicate through your work.
What I was going to share is something very similar to that, and this advice is for myself as well. Don't let yourself get in the way of telling a story. If you think it's really interesting, I think that is reason enough to continue down a thread. And it was a little overwhelming for me because I didn't start out with an idea per se. I just wanted to see what happened. And so trying to cut together the story afterwards, it was hard to piece out what the crux of the story was. But I do want to communicate to people that as you spend more and more time with it, it does become clear. It's like, you know, rubbing something down or smoothing a piece of wood. It does eventually smooth out. You just have to not be afraid to shed the tears or walk away or watch it over and over again until you feel good about it, and it will get done. And one thing really quick I wanted to share, I couldn't keep it in the film because it was out of context, but we visited a temple in the beginning of the film, and there was a monk and his mother who helped us locate my mom's father's great aunt. And the temples keep records of every single person that is part of this temple. And at one point we asked her, why is it that you keep all these names? And she said, because every person is important. And that was the most profound thing that we heard on that trip. Every person is important, every story is important. So I really urge people to do whatever they can to record the stories of everyone in their family, their community, whoever they think is just an interesting person. Just don't be afraid. If someone doesn't want to be filmed, ask them if they're comfortable with audio. If they're not comfortable with audio, ask them, can I write it down? Can I take photos? Just meet people where they are, and don't be offended if they don't want to talk. Some people truly cannot speak to their experiences because they're painful or they choose to not. Don't get frustrated. There are other ways to learn about your family other than just from one particular person. So don't give up.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us and speaking with me a little bit about your films. I also want to thank our audience who will be joining the 9th annual, wild that we've made it so far, our 9th annual Seattle Asian American Film Festival. We greatly appreciate everyone's support for both our festival and kind of our larger community here in Seattle. If you've not done so already, please take a moment to fill out our festival participant survey, where you'll find links in your ticketing confirmation emails. Data from the survey helps us get grants and sponsorships that make the festival possible, and it's another way you can support our festival. Please also feel free to check out our other programs that we have available at seattleaaff.org. That's seattleaaff.org. And you'll be able to find all of our ticketing information and see all of the still available tickets. Once again, on behalf of the Seattle Asian American Film Festival, I want to thank everyone who is joining us, who is watching, and stay safe and stay healthy, everybody.